This is Donna Sink, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Sometimes we get one, occasionally two, but today we welcome three world-class, award-winning, FAIA-honored modernist architects who also happen to be great friends so far. Seattle's Tom Kundig, Raleigh's Frank Harmon, and Fayetteville, Arkansas's Marlon Blackwell. And although Ice Cube, Weird Al Yankovic, and Art Garfunkel still haven't returned his calls, here's your host, George Smart.
Hi, folks. You may not know Ice Cube, Weird Al Yankovic, and Art Garfunkel as pillars, or should I say peloton? Peloton. No, wait. That's the commercial where extremely fit people bike really fast on crazy expensive stationary bikes.
Okay.
Watching other extremely fit people on TV biking really fast on crazy expensive stationary bikes. Anyway, Ice Cube, Weird Al Yankovic, and Art all studied architecture early in their careers before going on into music. I'm not aware that any of our guests today cut albums before becoming architects, but who knows? If they did, maybe they'll sing a few bars for us. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In her ongoing mythical adventure, realtor Angela Roll grew up in Switzerland, soaking in Peter Zumthor's amazing spa at Vowels by night while studying architecture with Corbusier's little-known grandson, French basketball player Pierre Stilts Corbusier.
Mon Dieu.
Like his grandfather, Stilts liked to keep everything up in the air, including their romance. So when she caught him in Paris with Frank Lloyd Wright's little-known great-granddaughter Brittany Lloyd Wright,
Oops, she did it again.
it was time to move to America, hatching a brilliant plan involving a little red dress, a welding torch, a case of Cristal, and a tango competition with the entire senior faculty of SciArc. Angela decided to use her architectural training to specialize in modernist real estate, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to where to buy an Eames ES906 lounger. And they're not easy to find. Angela Roll is your special modernist agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Such a great day. We've got a distinguished panel today, three gentlemen who first worked with us creating the George Matsumoto Prize back in 2012. They were rock stars of architecture then, and that has not changed over time. Tom Kundig is the son of noted modern architect Morris Kundig and lived in California, Washington, and Alaska before joining what is now Olson Kundig Architects in 1986. He came to national attention with 1998's Studio House and in 2002, the Chicken Point Cabin, a house that includes one of his most recognized and photographed gizmos, a 20-foot by 30-foot entire wall that opens and closes with a hand crank.
Oh.
Tom's honors include the Cooper Hewitt 2008 National Design Award, 11 National AIA Design Awards, way too many Washington AIA awards to count, and over 450 articles worldwide in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, Architecture Record, Dwell, and other publications. He lectures around the world, including Arkansas, and is author of Tom Kundig Houses, Tom Kundig Houses 2, Tom Kundig Works, and the classic novel later made into a movie starring Harrison Ford, Tom Kundig and the Temple of Doom. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. I love that intro. Thank you.
Arkansas architect Marlon Blackwell was born in Fürstenfeldbruck, Germany. As a military kid, he shuffled around the Philippines, Alabama, Florida, Colorado, and Montana, ending up with a Bachelor of Architecture from Auburn and a Master of Architecture from Syracuse, where he later taught.
Basketball powers.
Yes, indeed. And aren't they all orange, too?
Yeah, I think so.
Right? Yeah. He is the author of An Architecture of the Ozarks, the works of Marlon Blackwell, and has taught at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville since 1992, serving as the head of the architecture department for 6 years. His firm won more than 120 design awards and he received the 2012 Architecture Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Welcome, Marlon.
Welcome. I'm here.
Okay.
Glad to be here.
And you are driving to where today?
A fish camp to get some fish for lunch.
Oh, awesome. A little fish run. Okay.
There you go.
Architect Frank Harmon grew up in North Carolina and studied at the Architectural Association in London, where he later taught. He worked for North Carolina's Ed Lowenstein and New York's Richard Meyer, along the way teaching at Auburn and NC State University, which continues. Since 1981, Frank's work has been published in Architecture Record, Architectural Design, and other periodicals and books. He's received the Kemp Hefner Prize and the F. Carter Williams Gold Medal, plus over 60 design awards, the most ever for a North Carolina firm. Frank is the author of the book Native Places, Drawing as a Way to See, and he writes the Native Places blog, an online collection of drawings and writings about buildings and landscape. His wonderful Sketchy Tuesday drawing workshops are wildly popular, and he's been U.S. Modernist's biggest cheerleader since we started. Welcome, Frank.
Good to be here.
So, Marlon, before we get started, should we have a little prayer? I understand you spent 5 summers as a Bible salesman. How was that?
It was great. That's what everybody should do before they head off into the profession, I'll tell you. But no, it was great. It was places in the South that you only read about. See firsthand the landscape, the culture,
police are coming now for Marlon.
Right.
People.
You're not peddling counterfeit Bibles, are you?
No. Not the paper moon stuff. No.
Okay.
But it was a great experience, and you learn the art of telling stories and not letting the truth get in the way of a good story. So.
And did that help you in selling architecture later on?
Absolutely. Principles of selling are just the same, just the different things we're putting out there. We're selling ideas in many ways, and getting people to believe in the possibilities of, the vision has a lot to do with how you persuade them that it's worth doing.
Now, Marlon, I've seen a mariner's prayer and a soldier's prayer. Are there any prayers for architects? Something like, God, please give me the grace not to slap this client?
No, just please let this come in on budget. Yeah. God, I'll get right if it just let it come in on budget.
Right.
Yeah.
Tom, how did the three of you originally meet?
Oh, that's actually a pretty interesting question, George. It really revolves around Frank. Frank contacted me out of the blue, frankly, and you should ask Frank about his agenda, but I thought it was a terrific agenda. Most of us are in kind of these outpost locations around the country, the center being New York or the East Coast, Boston, and Frank was teaching a class at Harvard, and Frank's agenda was to bring these people from the outpost regions, the outer limits, back into at least a conversation back to the center of the architectural design universe. So that's where I met a number of colleagues that I always had deep respect for their work, but never really crossed paths with them because, again, we're all stretched around the country. And then the rest is, frankly, history. I don't know, Frank, do you want to talk about that? I thought it was a terrific program on so many levels. It sort of opened people's eyes to architecture being done around the country at a really high level, and I couldn't be more appreciative, frankly.
The reason I invited you to come is that the previous year I had done the same seminar, and Rick Joy was one of the participants. And at the end of it, he said, Frank, I've heard about this really interesting dude up in Seattle. Then you really ought to invite him to your next seminar, and his name is Tom Kundig. So Rick is the one who sort of alerted me to you.
Oh, interesting.
I met Marlon because I was asked to give a talk about 20 years ago in Arkansas to the AIA. And somebody heard I was going down there, and they said, if you're going to Arkansas, you really need to look up Marlon Blackwell. So one day I gave my talk, and Marlon sent me a note, and he said, meet me at this cafe in downtown, right on the main street. And so Judy and I went into this cafe, and here was this good-looking guy with a goatee wearing all black, including black shorts and black Doc Martens. And he introduced himself, said, "Hi, I'm Marlon Blackwell, and I recommend a banana cream pie."
Is that on your business cards now, Marlon? Hi, I'm Marlon Blackwell.
Yeah,
Try the
no.
pie.
Did you make it yourself?
No, man. I can't cook. No, not at all. But I remember that.
And actually, I'd had an earlier contact with Marlon. In 1980, I taught for 2 years at Auburn University. And I was fresh out of London, and I show up in the architectural studios at Auburn University, and I noticed most of the students have Bibles on their drawing boards. And I thought,
Marlon sold them to him.
well, I didn't know that. And I thought, whoa, these students are going to a higher power for their design. It was 10 years later that I learned it was Marlon.
That's great.
Oh, Lord. Got to work the crowd.
Now, all three of you were the subject of Mike Welton's 2015 book, Drawing from Practice, which shares the importance and creative process of hand drawing from architects, and there were many in the book, including Phil Freelon, Deborah Burke, Richard Meyer, and Lorinda Spear. Tell us a little bit about drawing, because I think most of the people who are under 30, at least, in design schools have moved away from that, of course, as CAD has come along, but it has a special importance all of its own and a special meaning that you guys talked about in the book.
Yeah. Well, I'll just jump in really quickly because the question is obviously a really good one. And we are, of an age where really our background comes out of the drawing tradition more than the CAD tradition, and we carry that on. I have to say a lot of the kids that are, doing all the digital work in the office, they can actually draw quite beautifully too. It's just how they solve problems. And that's where I was going with the whole drawing question. I think Frank and Marlon have a different way of looking at drawing. Drawing for me has always been, a little bit because of my more science background, is a way to work my way through a design problem. In other words, it's a tool that I use to sort of make some sort of connection back to whatever I'm working on, whether it's a small-scale project or a large-scale project. For me, drawing is a way to solve a problem. Again, I'll just reiterate, I draw through the problem, if that makes sense. So the drawing is more of a tool for me to make the architecture ultimately. Again, you work at a technical level with drawing, you work at a scale level, you work at a nuance level. For me, I find the hand is the most direct link to the brain, and that's kind of where that nuance level can show up in the design. So critical to the way I work.
Marlon?
I just seem to be drawing all my life. I was a cartoonist before I became an architect, so I've always drawn in very particular ways to express myself, but also to create narrative, a way of telling the story, a way of capturing the gesture of an idea. So that's, there's basically three types of drawings we kind of deal with. Experiential drawings tend to be more gestural. Analytical drawings tend to be more diagrammatic. And technical drawings, which tend to be dealing more with the construction of something. So we're working with all those drawings, and I've always done that. But I think the way in which I communicate with myself and with my clients and my team members in-house is through drawing directly with the hand, as Tom said. It's very direct, and then I tend to use a 9B pencil, something very soft, and so it tends not to be too finite, but is kind of more liquid in the way in which we can move and shape and keep working through an idea. And it's and the way I communicate. I often tell people I have voice-activated Revit in the office, which also helps, So I just say, hey, can you move this over here? Can you do this? And then I have somebody do that. But everyone in the office, in my office, that's been told that they expect to move up, they have to be able to also communicate by hand, by their own drawings, and create their own workflow between the hand and the digital. And that's what we try to do, is to empower everybody to communicate in similar ways.
I don't know the number 9 pencil. I'm as a mere mortal, I only know the number 2 pencil.
9B.
9B?
It's about the size of your index finger, probably.
Okay. It's like a wide...
Yeah. It's very soft.
Very soft, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very soft, yeah.
And they're good for experimenting with concepts, that kind of function?
Yeah. big gestures. Big
So
moves.
you wouldn't use it to fill out your tax return or anything?
Or make a shopping list.
You might.
No, but you could use it for a ransom note. Yeah, but
Graffiti.
yeah, I wouldn't fill out your taxes with it. That's for sure. Yeah.
Frank, tell us about your experience with drawing over time.
Well, all of us have been drawing since we were 2 years old. Children use drawing as a way to try to understand the world and put it together. By the time all of us were 5 or 6 years old, we were drawing in a way that Picasso greatly admired. So drawing is a skill that we've all experienced. For many of us, it got educated out of our way of being because we were taught there was a right way and a wrong way to draw. But I think someone like Tom or Marlon have continued to draw all their lives, and I suspect that they also use drawing as a way to understand the world. I use drawing in another way, too. I keep a sketchbook with me all the time, and whenever I see something that I'm puzzled by or I'm interested in, I'll make a little sketch of it. The sketch might take a minute, but it's a way of getting my attention, and once I make a sketch of it, I'll never forget that. I was in a taxi coming back from the airport last night, and there was a quick thunderstorm, and I saw the light of this thunderstorm through a dense grove of pine trees, and it was just incredibly beautiful. So I made a quick sketch of it with a little watercolor brush I've got. So it's
Wait a second. You're in the Uber making a watercolor?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm not driving. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
this is something that was just momentary. It was a flash of lightning, right?
Yeah. And
Okay.
most of the sketches are like that. It's a way of keeping notes. You know, Leonardo said that sketching was a way to understand the world.
DiCaprio?
No. The one we call Leonardo da Vinci. Yeah. So that's another role of drawing for me. It's a sort of a notebook of places I've been and things I've seen. And occasionally it becomes very useful as a resource for design.
Now, I wanted to ask the three of you, when you've got a new residential client coming to see you about a house, which is something all three of you are famous for, how far into the process do you do your first drawing? Is it on that meeting, or do you wait a little while? How do you take the client through the onboarding process of figuring out what they want? Why don't we start with you, Tom?
Well, it's the first time we meet, and I'll bet Frank and Marlon answer the same way, because almost immediately you're beginning to try to understand, as Marlon was saying, diagrammatically what they're describing in that context, wherever that context might be. So you're coming right out of the first 5 to 10 minutes already starting to put something down on paper, making it clear to the owner that this is just your way of thinking, or my way of thinking, that I'm just trying to articulate, picture is worth 1,000 words kind of situation where you're just trying to put down on paper what you're hearing, and it becomes the first step. Some people call those throwaway sketches. I don't think they're throwaway sketches at all. I think they're learning sketches, and if you can kind of maintain a very flexible sort of idea that these drawings are precious only as a way of thinking about next steps, they become extremely important to the process. And they never stop. I mean, they follow the project all the way to construction. And again, I'm sure Frank and Marlon will talk about, if you're on a job site and there's a situation that is maybe not clear, the ability to sit down on a piece of plywood or concrete driveway or something like that and sort of begin drawing an idea, again, it's a communication tool, it's a design tool, it's everything. It's just at the end of your arm, basically, and it's a way of solving the situation for next steps.
Can I interject something, Tom? It is a communication tool. I had coffee with a physical therapist this morning, and she was saying that writing is the closest form of communication next to speaking. In other words, using your hand. It's right up there with speaking in terms of the function of the brain. So it seems natural that if you're communicating with someone, that you can not only speak and hear, but that you can draw.
Interesting. Yeah.
And one of the things I've discovered with any number of architects' children, of which I am one, is that we watch our fathers or mothers constantly draw things out. at random places, like a McDonald's on the play mat. They're sketching out something, and you take on that same kind of habit. I find myself drawing things very crudely for other people, and they go, "Why are you drawing this? Why don't you just tell me?"
I've been in construction sites where you go up to the drywall and somebody has sketched out something that may or may not be relevant to whatever's being built that day, but is the nearest available surface. And I was just thinking that that's probably another case of somebody needing to make a point or solve a problem there on the spot.
Yeah, no.
It's going to get painted over eventually or something, but
I don't know if you guys have taken that back-of-house tour at the Salk Institute, and they take you down into the basement, and there is Louis Kahn, the master himself, solving a waterproofing detail on the concrete wall down in the basement. It's fantastic.
That's right. Yeah, it was going. I remember being on a site. Actually, Tom, if you remember when we were in the competition at Falling Water, and remember they had us in snowshoes and stuff. We're out on the site.
Oh, yeah.
On the snow in February. And we came up with our idea. I was with my colleague, John Bolkins, right there, but it was so cold, what do we draw? So we just took our fingers and we just drew in the snow.
Yep.
And then photographed our scheme in the snow and then went back to the office. And that became it. So, we all have a good friend named Brian McKay Lyons, great architect from Nova Scotia. And he has a saying that if you don't have ideas in the first 2 hours on the site with the client, you might not have any. Talent works quickly, and to be able to capture an idea through drawing on the site with the client is an important thing, and part of that dialogue to really, as Tom was getting, to really jumpstart the process. I mean, that's what you're doing. It's like rocket fuel to the process.
Is there any digital equivalent to that here in 2019, for instance? Do people whip out their iPad Pros and start drawing things now in meetings?
Yeah, I see that all the time. I think I have one. I haven't quite gotten comfortable with it to do it, but yeah, you can do that.
Steve Dumas does it all the time on his iPad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Another story I could tell is that I went to school at the Architectural Association in London. It was 3 18th century townhouses put together, beautifully proportioned rooms. And it was a given that students could draw on the walls. So you'd meet your professor, and you'd be talking something over. And at that time, Pentel pens had just appeared. And by the end of the term, the walls were absolutely covered with sketches. And every summer, the AA would repaint the whole school. And would be up and going again. And it was such a fantastic resource.
That's fantastic.
I hope somebody took pictures of those.
Well, that's the school that turned out people like Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid and Frank Harmon.
Yeah.
Just to name a few.
Marlon, the first major project that brought you some international acclaim was right here in North Carolina, a little house that grew out of a lecture you attended. Tell us about that.
You're talking about the Honey House.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of a good example of, great things in the small, I guess. So, yeah, I was teaching with Peter Eisman at the time, and so I was at a symposium in Ohio, and people talking about monads and Deleuze and Guattari and all this machinic and all this stuff, and I'm working on a little honey house for a beekeeper, and just listening to them talk about self-generating systems and stuff. And in just translating what I was hearing, I started drawing, and moving away from the kind of literal metaphors of bees and stuff and more into the systems, how would you make a wall that could be analogous, let's say, to a comb of honey that would be strong and then would allow light and would allow for storage and display of honey, do 4 or 5 things. And so this one wall architectural element becomes the driver for this little 8-foot wide by 24-foot structure. So it's just kind of being in the moment, taking from whatever's around you and interpreting it as it's given to you into the way that you want it to be. And that was just one of those moments where everything kind of came together, and then a drawing was spontaneously produced that drove the rest of the project. It never really wavered from that initial drawing. It's pretty amazing. The Moore Honey House, yeah.
And Tom, you've got a house in North Carolina too.
Yeah, in the Hill Country, and that was really, again, we're so privileged to be doing these projects around the country because, of course, you're involved in different cultures and in different environments, different climates, whatever, and that was certainly a terrific introduction to that corner of the country, coming from the northwest corner and reaching all the way down to the southeast. It was obviously a terrific client. It actually raises kind of an interesting point about the value of these, and Marlon touched on it, the value of a residential project. You know, in a way, maybe the architecture profession almost has turned its back a little bit on the residential arena, although it's a huge arena. But one thing that's really important for my career, and it continues in my career, is that these residential projects become these research and development sort of moments in time. And that was certainly one of them, to deal with to understand it, to deal with a different climate than we have up here in the Northwest. But on so many different levels, if you're working at a residential scale on some of your projects, they really become your science experiments to sort of explore ideas that maybe need a little bit further development. Residential projects tend to happen quickly. When you get into the larger commercial institutional work, it takes more time, and of course you have to come at those projects with a very, very firm understanding for any number of reasons on how to solve the problems. Again, the residential arena gives you that privilege to experiment and explore ideas.
And Frank, the earliest house I could find for you was the one you did for Stephen Wainwright in Emerald Isle. Was that the first major residence, or was there one before that?
No, that's my first house in North Carolina, and I still love that house.
A beach house?
It was a beach house on the Bogue Banks.
Oh.
And the client was a marine biologist, and he had a large family, 5 children, and they loved to collect dead things, as he said. Their house was absolutely full of snake skins and lobster shells, and he wanted a house where they could feel comfortable at the coast and, collect all their dead things. And primarily, he wanted a house that he didn't have to worry about it being blown away in a hurricane. So that became my first chance to work with a really good structural engineer whose name was T.C. Howard. And he helped with the structure, and I helped with the client. And it was a great project. It was a great way to begin because it was so specific to its place.
Structural engineers are really important partners for the houses that the three of you design. I've become a real fan of a dude named Monty Clark, who is like your partner in crime for making some of your amazing houses actually stand up and function. What's it like to work with Monty?
Well, I don't know, Frank or Marlon, if you work with Monty, but I work with Monty a lot. And I don't know if you know this, but Monty was actually an architecture student early in his university years, and then ultimately went into engineering. So Monty already has an understanding, or at least an appreciation, of what it means to do architecture, and certainly what it means to do modern architecture. And as we all know, modern architecture is really a soup-to-nuts architecture. You're coming out of the ground, and you're already solving basically the cabinet system because of all the sort of relationships that begin emerging, because your structural systems, your mechanical systems, electrical, all the systems actually are part of the building itself. So you're working, and obviously the structure is the skeleton of the building, and the precision of that and the proportions of that skeleton are ultimately critical to the architecture. So that kind of partnership, to work with an engineer that understands sort of what the architectural end game is, which is to make this beautiful thing out of the stuff you're making the architecture out of, is I think critical. And I couldn't be luckier, frankly, to be able to work with Monty. I think for close to 25 years at this point.
Yeah. Where's Monty out of, Tom?
Monty's out of he was out of Seattle for a while, but he's moved back to Montana. He was actually an outfitter for a while, bought a ranch and then kind of did outfitting for a while, but also at the same time was doing architecture. And of course, we all live in a digital world, and so it's a small town outside of Billings, Montana. I think he's still there in Columbus. It doesn't really matter where he is, which is sort of interesting, and we can kind of communicate over the digital world.
fine.
Now, I've got somebody similar to that Dee Nordenson is who I've kind of collaborated with as well. I think the key is having a structural engineer that isn't just task-oriented or looking to do it once or whatever, but is really interested in being a true collaborator and having a dialogue early on. I think that makes the best kind of partnership in that regard, with any consultant for that matter. It's really key.
I get a lot of emails and phone calls from dissatisfied clients, and always their dissatisfaction with modernist houses is with the builder. It seems like that finding a builder who really knows how to do modern and doesn't just make it up or tries to change it can be difficult, particularly in certain areas of the country. How do you all find builders that really know what they're doing?
Former architecture students, a good place to start. But I think it's just a way of qualifying and getting on board. When I first started out, we really didn't have builders. We had subcontractors, and nobody wanted to build our stuff. So we would just get the subcontractors together and kind of manage the project for the owner so that we could afford it, and we could have that front-end DNA of the project come to us via the subcontractor, the different trades, so that the unique things we wanted to do, we could have vetted in the most optimal ways by the subcontractors. And so that's how we started out. And only over time did we begin to discover people who had either gone to architecture school or who grew up doing really fidelity to craft. And you sort of kind of help them come along with you. So they're growing with you in a way. I've had several people that build our stuff that they started out small like we did, and they've slowly grown as they've grown in experience doing a house here, a house there, contemporary. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I completely agree with Marlon. It's a research. It's a research and development. And people will ask me, well, you're lucky you have these terrific contractors up in the Northwest and the West Coast, whatever, or on the East Coast. We don't have those kind of contractors here. I disagree completely. I think any place we work, there are the kind of people that can either learn or are just frankly committed to making beautiful things. And once you engage those characters into a construction project, it's amazing what you learn, first of all, and then where they can take a project even to a higher level. A lot of people will say to me, well, you get all these steel buildings and, we just don't have that kind of steel fabricator here. And again, because of my background being a little bit in a hot rod culture in eastern Washington, I can say, well, do you have a hot rod shop in town? And, generally there is somebody there, and there are amazing welders and metal workers in any community. You just have to first see if they're, of course, willing to engage a building project. And if they are, I have to say the learning curve for me as an architect, working with these craftspeople at their particular skill, is just priceless.
Absolutely.
One of my last houses was built by a former architecture student and his partner, and they're now in their early 60s. And I've never had such a beautifully constructed house, nor have I had such good advice and even details about how to vent the eaves or put a railing on a staircase as I got. So, they gave as much design advice. That they were just fantastic. I generally, with my clients, try to get them to choose the contractor at an early stage so that they're working with this person who understands the design and is excited about building it.
So that they form a relationship earlier.
Yeah, I've got kind of a bullpen of maybe 4 or 5 contractors who are familiar with doing good work for me and other contemporary architects in the area.
Absolutely.
Do you ever find subcontractors that you work with long enough that they decide to become contractors themselves, coordinate with other trades?
Absolutely. Our prime general started out just doing framing and actually did the rain screen for our house, and then he evolved into other trades, and then got into masonry. And the next thing you know, he's a general contractor. Because he's learned the business and how to schedule and how to coordinate and all that. But just started having his own particular trade, and it's evolved into a very successful general now. He's allowed himself to grow, and that's key.
It's really different experience depending on whether you're the client or the architect or the contractor. I noticed that in Europe, when we've taken groups over there with U.S. Modernists, the European architects are very strict about what they do. There's not this kind of think outside the box culture or a maker culture that we have here in the U.S. Do you all see that as well?
Yeah, I would totally agree. For whatever reason, we've done some work in Europe, and I have to say, for whatever reason, I think there's more experimentation. It's in the residential arena. It has an effect, an international effect, which you can kind of recognize. You see things happening here in North America. I include Canada in that because I agree with Marlon. Brian is doing some terrific stuff up in Canada. You also see it in Latin America. I'll tell you, Latin America, some of the most exciting experiments are happening down south. We're doing a little bit of work in Brazil and Argentina. It's a different culture.
Yeah, I recently got to know Jean-Pierre Cruz, Barclay and Cruz in Peru. Their work is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. I've been spending a good bit of time in Italy and Rome these last few months, and, I see amazing things happening with adaptive reuse. Not a lot of new architecture happening in Rome, but a lot of interventions and repurposing of what they have. And, they have some of the traditions of Scarpa and Franco Albini and some of those traditions being carried on, but some really interesting ways in which they approach the new within the old that I find very invigorating. And they're, again, building on the shoulders of those greats that have come before them. But there is a level of precision there that is sort of built into the certain cultures that I find. That,
well, they also spend much more money on their buildings than we do.
Yeah, they do. And sometimes they have to because of the energy requirements and things like
and
that.
The regulatory. Marla, I was going to say, after we finished off that banana cream pie, down in Arkansas, you took us to see some of your projects in Fayetteville. And I remember thinking to myself, this is so extraordinary because Marlon's thinking it out, not just at the beginning, but as he goes along. And he's taking this quarter-inch piece of steel and bending it in a way that it can be bent. And the design is evolving out of that. And I think that's actually a relatively American experience, that we are more comfortable with doing things ad hoc.
Mm-hmm.
And exploring
in the moment.
And working with craftspeople.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're a culture of pragmatists versus we're not based in a culture of beauty in the way you find much in Europe. So we often think of ourselves as MacGyver architects. You give us a paperclip and we can make something out of it.
Make it a bazooka. Yeah, right.
But, that's both good and bad because the expectations immediately are raised and lowered at the same time.
That's true. That's very true.
Within the resources. Then they wonder, why does it cost so much? Well, a lot of stars have to align in those improvised moments. I mean, we have a church we did where it was for an Eastern Orthodox Christian community, and they couldn't afford a dome. And, in the moment we're building it, and they couldn't afford what we spec. Contractor couldn't custom make one, and we're like, what to do? And then, we wound up changing beer for a satellite dish to make the dome, and skin coating was faster.
One of those big old satellite dishes?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, that's genius.
Yeah, well, it gives the folks a kind of direct connection to God that way. But the point is that I think Frank's right. We're okay to be in the moment, and if the architecture is not overly prescribed and still evolving through construction in terms of how you pull it off, then you can make it happen. If everything's prepackaged and signed, sealed, delivered, and becomes legalistic, it's a little bit harder to do that. So that works on certain projects and at certain scales. It doesn't work for every project. But
I think Marlon's making a good point that again that works at a certain scale. I think in particular it works as a residential scale. All three of us are architects. that follow a project from beginning to end, all the way through the construction. Like Marlon's satellite dish, that's a perfect example of being Johnny on the spot, figuring out a situation. For me, Chicken Point, the big fireplace, that was a scrap yard outside of Spokane, Washington, that had all the Alaska pipeline that was left over from the pipeline, and we just made a big fireplace out of it. It just became the structural element of the building, but it happened during kind of the construction process, and it was actually a money, basically a cost savings decision. But again, that sort of what Marlon's describing, that MacGyver-like attitude, it's where the inventions happen, and some of the most, I think, satisfying moments of the architecture, working with the craftspeople and working with the situation and the clients, leads to stuff that ultimately can have a ripple effect into the larger projects in the larger community. It's super exciting moments when they happen.
Well, my last question, gentlemen, who do you all admire? Who are the architects, the superstars of tomorrow, people that are, say, under 40 now, that you've got your eye on that are doing really great things?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to avoid the answer. and here's how I'm going to avoid the answer, George, and apologies for that. I was going through some old magazines, in my basement, just sort of cleaning it out, and there was a Progressive Architecture magazine, a magazine that's since folded, and on the cover it was Vanguards of the Future, the young architects of the future. And I went through the magazines, and I didn't recognize a single architect that was any part of the future. I don't know. I'm sure there's somewhere, but it was an interesting moment because there is almost I don't know if it's fetish or whatever on being so creative and so much part of the future. Naturally, they're part of the future. But to predict, because architecture is, I think it really is a profession of time, it takes a long time to sort of develop into something that I think has the kind of effect that is meaningful. I think it's unpredictable. So, sorry, George, I'm going to avoid the answer.
That's a great answer, because I'm always looking forward to those my elders, let's say, and then my contemporaries, my peers, two that we're talking to, Tom and Frank right here, and there's a host of other folks that we're all of a similar age that I'm looking to and amazed at what they are capable of doing, and on a consistent basis, which is, I think, another aspect of this, is that, and why I think Tom is right, it's hard to predict, because somebody could come up with something amazing in their 20s, and, you never hear from them again, because they had that one moment. It's like music, and it really is hard to predict, and when I look back and see who's the generation coming up, that generation doesn't, for me, we've gotten into our 60s now, doesn't extend beyond, mid-40s, that next generation. And there's some really good people coming up behind there, I think, that have proven over time to be consistent in the work. So I think, for me, it's consistency and evolution of it. But it's hard to reach back into somebody in the 20s or even their mid-30s and say, oh, okay, well, this is the future. I find that to be very difficult. I've been at the American Academy in Rome the last couple of months, and some really wonderful young people that are, Rome Prize winners and such there. But it would be hard to say, oh, yes, that's the future. I think time will tell. And that's it. But it's an exciting time, just in general, to be an architect. And I think much of the work's being produced right now in our own generation is the present, and in many ways, the future, too. I mean, it bears itself out time and time again. That's really substantive stuff. So.
Frank, you want to take a stab at not answering this question?
It's okay. We're not recording this or anything.
Well, I do agree that there's a reason architecture is referred to sometimes as an old person's profession, because it does take even 20 years to really get a grasp on how a design can become a material reality and what works and what doesn't. I will say that some of the most exciting things that I see is the work of a place like the Rural Studio in Alabama, where these young architects take a project all the way from a client through the design, through the fundraising, through building it, and even to serving barbecue at the opening celebration. And I think there's a basis there of a holistic view of architecture, from place to client to materials to barbecue sauce, that bodes well for the future.
Well, on that tasty note, I want to thank all three of you, for this has been a real pleasure and a real honor to have you all on at the same time. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for Modernist houses. 919-995-0550. Okay, Tom?
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to hear past shows, discover 7,000 mid-century modernist houses, and access 2.6 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song, that was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Guest research is led by Cindy Stratton.
Not her real name.
An enigma to some, feared by others. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Giles. George and I'll be back soon with another salvage from the scrapyard, hand-cranked, freehand sketched edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.